As you probably know, the hottest chess player on the planet right now is Hikaru Nakamura. His Twitch channel and his YouTube channel are absolutely blowing up, and he recently defeated world chess champion Magnus Carlsen in a best-of-3 set of mini matches. We've already covered a couple of his greatest games on this channel, but in our next several videos, we'll look back at some of the best games of his career. We start here in 1999 when Hikaru had just turned 12 years old, and he's playing Nigerian international master Oladapo Adu. Hikaru decides to open the game with pawn to e4, and his opponent Adu responds with c5, the Sicilian defense. We get knight f3, pawn to d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, and here, instead of the almost automatic knight f6, which encourages knight c3, developing and blocking the c-pawn, we get pawn to e6. This is a bit of an original move, very playable, but unusual because it allows white the opportunity to play pawn c4 and establish the Maroczy bind, a big spatial clamp. Now, I think top players today, and I kind of suspect even Hikaru today, will go for this opportunity when presented it. However, in this game, after pawn to e6, we see a young Hikaru, like most young players, playing for the most open and aggressive line. He plays knight c3, just getting on with the development and reverting to normal Sicilian lines. However, Adu's not looking to stay in normal Sicilian lines. He plays natural moves, but not the most theoretical moves. a6, knight c6, knight f6. He's going to put his queen on c7 here, and this has allowed Hikaru, I think, very free development and easy castling right here. I don't think Hikaru is winning or anything, but Adu's not playing the theoretical and challenging lines that would have restricted his opening setup a little bit more and had better chances to equalize. Now, in this position after bishop d7, we do see, I think, basically the one major slip in the game from Hikaru. That is the move pawn to g4. The idea that black has is knight takes d4, which is played, but after bishop takes d4, Adu does not follow up with pawn to e5. This is an idea that you should definitely hold on to if it's new to you. You will see this in future games. This move obviously attacks the bishop on d4, but it also threatens to come over to g4 and skewer the queen and the rook and win material. Now, that's not the whole story. Black's king is still on e8, it's not castled, and it still needs a fair bit of time to castle, at least if it's going to go kingside. Because you're opening up the middle of the board with your king in the middle, you're going to have to consider sacrificial lines from your opponent that try to create an initiative. And the best way to do that here is to capture on e5, and after capturing back, go for queen g3. The bishop cannot be captured because of the pin, and e5 is under threat, so bishop d6. But in this position, after bishop e3, even though black can win a pawn here on g4, black is going to have to suffer a lot of pressure from white, who's very well developed, if black wants to do that. The position is pretty unclear according to the engine, but one can understand why Adu would not want to go into this line and allow his opponent a lot of very juicy attacking options. So, instead, Adu plays bishop c6, but by not challenging Hikaru, I think he does commit to being worse from here through the rest of the game. Hikaru has multiple good options here, including pawn to g5, but he decides on an interesting commitment. Bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and although this structure can be totally okay for black in lots of classical Sicilian lines, in this case it doesn't seem to be working out well because Hikaru has f5 ready right away. He's immediately threatening to capture here and then capture on f6, and with his next several moves he's going to force black to play pawn to e5 and lock into a passive structure where black has a lot of weaknesses to cover. b5 hits the bishop falls back, b4 hits the knight falls back, and finally black has to deal with the pressure here, and so pawn to e5. Some of the advantages that white gains after forcing e5 are pressure on the half-open file on the d-pawn, the access to this square right here, also the ability to pressure f6, and even the idea to break through with g5, hold on to that idea. All of this is a lot for black to handle, and black really needs good counterplay to deal with this, but I don't think black has counterplay in this position. In fact, the next few moves from Hikaru are really good for reducing any kind of counterplay that Adu might have achieved. He plays his king to b1. He plays his bishop to c4, and he plays pawn to b3. And once this structure is reached, I have no idea how black can do anything to disrupt white on the queen side. So after b3, we're seeing Hikaru start to build up. We see queen b7, queen e2, rook to b8, and now there's already a nice breakthrough for Hikaru. He misses this one and keeps building, but he'll get more opportunities before too long. This breakthrough was pawn to g5. This is very nice because after fg5, pawn to f6 in this position, you can't capture because you're just getting smoked here on the f file. And if after f6 you try to pull back to f8 to hold this d pawn, there are multiple nice continuations for white, but the most pleasing one is knight to f5. Now, bringing the knight into f5 does leave e4 undefended, so bishop takes e4, but there are, again, multiple nice continuations for white, but the nicest, cleanest, and deadliest is rook takes d6. Boom. This is a really fine move. It has multiple points. First off, both rooks are hanging, but it doesn't matter. If bishop takes d6, knight takes, and then black is forked right here. The queen falls. And if the bishop captures on h1 here, then the queen now gets access to e5, and black is just getting mated. The king is obviously dead in the water. And finally here, if the bishop captures the knight, then you have queen takes e5 check, and the bishop can fall back here, and we can just sacrifice through rook takes e6. And again, we're smoking black. I'll illustrate this. This is actually forced mate. Queen takes e6 check. And if you try to run king d8, obviously the rook is coming in. And if bishop e7, trying to give back some material, there's multiple ways you can do this. Rook d1 is actually the preference according to the engine. I'm actually going to show this one. This is my favorite. And if rook here, then you have, well, actually queen f7 right away. And you could even go for f7 and then queen over to h6. There's so many nice mates to pick from. So this was a very, very nice line here with pawn to g5, back on move 22. Instead, Hikaru did go for rook h to e1, which builds up, and we're going to have to see him break through a little bit later. So rook over to g8, pawn to h3, queen d7, now queen d2, rook g5, knight h5, queen b7, and this is the moment to pause your video and try to figure out what you should do. So what Hikaru did was knight takes f6, boom, this is the breakthrough in the game. After knight takes f6, white is winning 2 pawns for the piece. Queen takes d6 right here. But most importantly, white has broken through and the king is exposed over here. And there are big threats to the bishop and big threats to this pawn on e5. I think another really important theme here is that these pieces on the king side and these pieces on the queen side are struggling to communicate and to coordinate any kind of reasonable defense. Now, in this position, if you want to hold on to the pawn on e5, you need to pull back the bishop on this diagonal. But among other things, this allows pawn to f6, and this closes the bishop out permanently. As long as you keep that pawn on f6 defended, that bishop is never moving, so you're effectively not even down material. And obviously, you have a huge bind, and the computer even says it's so over that it's +9 in here. It's like white was up a queen. So after queen takes d6, at this point, Adu decides, well, I can't hold on to e5. That's just too deadly. So I'm going to give it up, bishop back to e7, and then pawn to f6. And I'm going to try and hold in the middle of the board. Queen e6, rook g7, and now pawn to e5. This move obviously looks like it should be crushing. If you capture this pawn, then well, everything wins, but f6 wins very immediately. But also you're just threatening to capture here, of course. Again, this is just a crushing looking move, but Adu does have an idea ready. That is bishop d7. And he sort of traps the white queen in the very middle of the board right here. If the queen pulls back to the 2 safe squares, then he's going to give Adu the opportunity to trade the queens, and Adu's not really going to be worse in that position. So this is a moment, again, to pause your video and try to figure out what Hikaru played. Well, At the age of 12, Hikaru found one of the finest moves of his career. Queen takes f6. Boom! This is a beautiful, beautiful move to play. He's already down a piece, and he offers up his queen to the bishop right here. Now, black doesn't really have a choice because white's position is monstrous, and also this rook is in huge trouble. So you got to accept the queen sacrifice. Bishop takes f6, but after e takes f6 check, there is a monster discovered check here. I do want to appreciate that black is down a full queen in this position, but white is down a full queen in this position, but Hikaru is winning back material right away, and he's just crushing in this position. It is over, although clean and accurate play is delivered by Hikaru. First off, we have a choice. What are we doing with the king? And we only have a couple choices. If king d8 here, then f takes g7, and you can't stop me from queening on g8 anyway. But if you really want to kind of dab on the opponent in this position, you can go for two queens here, f6 and f7. What is black doing to stop this? This is totally, totally over. So Adu does play the more natural move, king f8, defending that rook. And now after captures, he gets king takes on g7. And now rook to e7. So this move is really the dagger blow at the end of this queen sacrifice. It's going to pick up the bishop, and after the bishop falls, then white is already up material. He was down a full queen a moment ago, and now he's up material with a rook, a bishop, and 3 pawns for the queen. Now Adu's going to try for some activity here, which is absolutely the best thing he can do, but his king is still exposed, and therefore Hikaru is looking for forcing moves to try to take advantage of the exposed position of the king. There are multiple good moves, but he finds g5 check, which is a very clean and efficient continuation here. Basically, in all lines, he's going to either win his opponent's queen or he's going to force checkmate. So let's look at all those lines very quickly. First off, if king e5, then there's rook e7 check, skewering and winning the queen. In a lot of these cases, there's going to be multiple winning moves, but I'm just going to try and give kind of what I think is the simplest. King takes just runs into bishop d3. Instead of a skewer, we have a pin. We reverse the tactic. And after king takes g5, which was played in the game, we get rook to g1. And actually, Adu resigned in this position. Let's think about why he resigned. So if king f6, you have rook f7 check, pushing the king to e5, then rook e7 check, skewering and winning the queen that way. If king takes f5, once again, we have bishop to d3 with the pin, winning the queen that way. If king f4, then we have rook to g4 check with another skewer that wins the queen. And if king goes to either h5 or h4, there's immediate mate right here. Now, I think the finest continuation is this last one here. I do kind of wish that Adu had allowed this on the board, as it would have been a very honorable conclusion to the game. That is king to h6. This is almost sufficient to defend, as in there's only one continuation that's completely decisive for white, but that continuation is checkmate in 4. And it goes rook to d6 check, king up to h5, bishop to f7 check, king up, and rook to h6 with a beautiful checkmate. That was actually checkmate in 3, but black could have thrown away the queen there, which would have made it checkmate in 4. I hope that you enjoyed this game from the young 12-year-old Hikaru Nakamura. If you want to see more of Hikaru Nakamura's best chess games, then simply click on the playlist that's sitting right on top of your screen.